In the year 3019 of the Third Age, when the War of the Ring had passed into memory and peace had settled upon the lands of Gondor, a strange terror began to manifest in the southern reaches of the realm. From the marble halls of Minas Tirith came urgent summons, carried by swift riders to every corner of Middle-earth, where courage might yet be found. Elrond Half-Elven received such a missive in the twilight halls of Rivendell, its parchment sealed with the white tree of Gondor. The words, penned in Aragorn's own hand, spoke of an ancient evil stirring near the borders of Far Harad, a crimson tower that had risen from the sands like a bloody fang, and about which the dead walked as guardians terrible and fell. The Crimson Spire, whispered Gandalf the White, who had arrived that very evening as if drawn by the urgency of the message. His gray eyes, usually twinkling with mirth, now held the weight of ages. Long have I feared this day would come. The tower was built in the elder days by servants of Morgoth, and though it fell when Beleriand was broken, its foundations remained deep in the earth, waiting. From Rohan came Éomer, now king, with a small company of his finest riders. From the glittering caves came Gimli the dwarf, his axe gleaming and his beard braided with silver ring. From the woodland realm came Legolas, his bow singing in the wind, accompanied by a dozen of his kin. And from the Grey Havens came Círdan the shipwright, ancient beyond measure, bearing with him lore that had been forgotten by younger folk. They gathered in the courtyard of the last homely house as the sun set behind the misty mountain, 13 in all, for 3 rangers of the north had joined them. Grim men whose names were known only to the wind. Elrond spoke to them of the peril, how merchants from the south had brought tales of a red tower that pierced the sky like a wound, and how all who approached it found themselves beset by phantoms of ancient malice. The company departed Rivendell with the dawn, taking the road south through the gap of Rohan. The journey was swift but troubled, for even the beasts of the field seemed to sense some wrongness in the southern air. Birds flew not south but north, as if fleeing from some nameless dread, and the very grass seemed to whisper warnings in languages long forgotten. At Edoras, they were welcomed by Éowyn, now queen beside her husband Faramir, prince of Ithilien. She pressed upon them provisions and words of encouragement, though her fair face was clouded with concern. Evil dreams have plagued our sleep these past months, she confided to Elrond. Always the same vision, a tower red as blood reaching toward the stars, and about its base, the forms of the dead marching in endless circle, and always, at its apex, a light that burns like a baleful eye. From Edoras, they rode hard to Minas Tirith, where King Elisar awaited them in the Tower of Ecthelion. Aragorn had aged well in his years as king, but now his face bore lines of worry deep as carven stone. Maps were spread before them, showing the southern reaches of Gondor, and beyond that, the trackless wastes of Far Harad. The tower stands here, he said, placing his finger upon a spot marked with red ink, at the edge of the great desert, where once the river Harnan bent eastward toward the sea. My scouts report that no living thing may approach within a league of its base, for the very air burns with malice, and the dead rise from the sand to bar all passage. Círdan studied the map with eyes that had seen the fall of Gondolin. The Crimson Spire, he murmured, was built as a watchtower in the wars against the Valar. From its height, the servants of darkness could see all the southern lands, and its foundations were laid with sorcery most foul. If it rises again, then some power has awakened that should have slept forever. They sailed from Pelargir aboard a ship of Dol Amroth, its white sails billowing in the autumn wind. The Prince Imrahil had given them his finest vessel, the Sulruin, and with it a crew of 20 mariners skilled in southern waters. Yet as they passed the mouth of Anduin and turned eastward along the coast, even these seasoned sailors grew troubled by signs and portents. The sea itself seemed wrong. Where the waters should have been blue-green, they were stained crimson, as if with blood, and no fish swam in their depths. Strange lights danced beneath the waves at night, and more than once the lookouts reported seeing the shapes of drowned men walking upon the ocean floor, their eyes glowing with unholy fire. On the third night, as they sailed past the Bay of Belfalis, the Silruin entered waters that no map had charted. A fog arose from the sea, thick and red as arterial blood, and within its depths they heard the sound of oars and the creaking of ancient timbers. Through the murk came the outline of another ship, or what had once been a ship. The crimson wake appeared before them like a vision from nightmares. Her hull was black as charcoal, her sails the color of dried blood, and upon her deck stood figures that had once been men. Their flesh was pale as pearl, their eyes empty sockets filled with baleful light, and in their hands they bore weapons corroded by centuries of salt and sorrow. "Ghost ship!" cried the helmsman, but Gandalf raised his staff, and the light of his power drove back the phantom vessel. Yet not before they had seen the figurehead at her prow, a beautiful woman with arms outstretched, her face twisted in eternal anguish, and about her throat a chain of crimson gems that burned like captured stars. The fog lifted with the dawn, but the memory of the ghostly ship lingered in all their hearts. They had seen the first guardians of the Crimson Spire, and they knew that greater perils lay ahead. They made landfall at a desolate harbor that had no name, where the bones of ancient quays jutted from the sand like the ribs of some titanic beast. Here the mariners would wait, though none expected to see the company again alive. The land before them stretched away in endless dunes of red sand, and in the distance, like a needle of crimson glass, rose the Spire. Even at 20 leagues distant, the tower dominated the southern horizon. It was tall beyond measure, narrow as a blade, and red as fresh spilled blood. Around its base, the very air shimmered with heat and malice, and sometimes they could see shapes moving, the forms of the guardian dead performing their endless vigil. Gimli, ever practical, had brought water enough for the journey, but even as they began their march across the desert, they discovered that their provisions spoiled with unnatural speed. The water grew bitter and foul, the bread crumbled to dust, and the dried meat crawled with maggots that should not have been. "The land itself is poison," observed Círdan, his ancient features grave. "The Spire draws all life from the earth and corrupts it for its own purposes. We must make swift passage, or we shall perish not from thirst, but from the malice of the place itself." Yet swift passage proved impossible, for as they journeyed deeper into the desert, the very sands began to whisper. At first it was merely the sound of wind across the dunes, but soon they could distinguish words in languages both ancient and terrible. The whispers spoke of defeat and despair, of hopes crushed and dreams turned to ash. They told of the glory of darkness and the futility of light, seeking always to turn the hearts of the company toward shadow. Legolas, whose keen ears caught every nuance of the ghostly voices, grew pale as moonlight. "They speak of us," he said to Elrond in the Grey Tongue. "They know our names, our deeds, our fears. Something watches us from that accursed tower, and it knows us all too well." On the third day of their desert journey, they came upon a circle of standing stones that rose from the sand like broken teeth. Each stone was twice the height of a man, and carved with runes that hurt the eyes to look upon. In the center of the circle lay a well of black water that reflected no light, though the sun blazed overhead. "A place of power," said Gandalf, his staff glowing with white fire. "Built by the enemy's servants in days of old. We should pass around it." But even as he spoke, shapes began to emerge from the sand around the stones. First came the skeletons of men, their bones bleached white by the desert sun, but moving with terrible purpose. Then came the forms of ancient warriors, still clad in corroded mail, their faces hidden behind helms that had not been forged by any wholesome craft. "The first guardians," whispered one of the rangers, his hand upon his sword hilt, "the dead of ages past, bound to serve the Spire until the ending of the world." Didi. The battle was joined ere any could speak another word. Gimli's axe rang against bone and rusted steel, while Legolas sent arrow after arrow into the ranks of the undead. But for every phantom that fell, two more rose from the sand, and their weapons bore a chill that bit deeper than any winter wind. It was Hírden who turned the tide, speaking words of power in the tongue of the Eldar. The black water in the well began to boil and steam, and one by one, the guardian dead crumbled to dust. But the effort cost the ancient elf dearly, and when the battle was done, his hair was white as snow, and his hands trembled like autumn leaves. The spire grows stronger, he gasped. Even now, I can feel its influence reaching out like fingers of ice. We must make haste, or we shall all become servants of its will. Beyond the circle of stone, the desert gave way to a vast depression in the earth, a valley that stretched for leagues in all directions and was carpeted with the bones of the dead. Here lay the remains of armies that had marched against the Spire in ages past, the proud hosts of Númenor in their gleaming mail, the desert warriors of Far Harad with their curved scimitars, and stranger folk whose origins were lost to time. Among the bones grew flowers of a sickly hue, pale blooms that gave off a sweet stench, and whose petals were veined with crimson like blood vessels. Where these flowers grew thickest, the bones were arranged in patterns that suggested ritual and sacrifice, and at the center of each pattern stood a single skull facing toward the spire. "Do not touch the flowers," warned Gandalf, his voice sharp with urgency. "They are nourished by the malice of this place, and their poison brings madness and despair. Many who have sought to reach the spire have been overcome by their foul perfume and turned to servants of darkness." Seat. Yet even as he spoke, they heard singing, voices fair and sweet as spring morning, calling to them from among the bone field. The song spoke of rest and peace, of laying down their burden and joining the eternal dance of the dead. More than one of the company felt his steps falter, and Gimli had to be restrained from wandering toward the source of the melody. It was Legolas who spied the singers, women of surpassing beauty, with hair like spun gold and eyes like sapphire. They danced among the bones with grace ethereal, their white robes flowing about them like mist. But as the elf prince watched, he saw that their feet left no marks in the dust, and where their tears fell, the pale flowers bloomed anew. "Spirits of the slain," he breathed. "The spire has bound their souls to serve as its heralds, turning their beauty into a trap for the living. Cover your ears, my friends, lest their songs lead us to join their ghostly chorus." As they climbed from the Valley of Bones toward the base of the spire, the very air grew thick and oppressive. The tower loomed above them now, its crimson surface smooth as glass and warm to the touch, despite the cool desert night. Around its base ran a wall of black stone, seamless save for a single gate of red iron that stood open like a waiting mouth. Before the gate stood two figures that had once been men, but were now something far more terrible. Tall they were, and broad of shoulder, clad in armor that gleamed like fresh blood. Their faces were hidden behind helms wrought in the likeness of snarling beasts, and in their hands they bore swords that burned with unholy fire. "The Nazgul!" cried one of the rangers, his voice breaking with terror. But Gandalf shook his head grimly. "Nay, these are older, and perhaps more fell. Behold the Crimson Guard, the first servants of the Shadow to be bound to the spire. They have stood watch here since the elder days, and neither time nor death has any power over them." The Guardians made no move to attack, but simply stood in silent vigil. Their presence was like a weight upon the heart, and the very ground beneath their feet was stained red, as if with the blood of countless victims. As the company approached, the Guardians raised their burning swords in salute, or perhaps in warning. "We seek passage to the tower," spoke Elrond, his voice carrying all the authority of his ancient lineage. "In the name of the Valor, and for the good of all free peoples, we would enter this accursed place and cleanse it of its evil." The Guardians' reply came not in words, but in action. As one, they stepped forward and crossed their flaming blades, barring the path to the gate. The meaning was clear: none would pass while they yet stood. The battle that followed was like no other in the long years of war against darkness. The Crimson Guard fought with skill beyond mortal ken, their burning swords leaving trails of fire in the air, and their movements swift as striking serpents. Gimli's axe rang against their armor without leaving so much as a scratch, while Legolas found that his arrows passed through them as if through mist. It was Círdan who found the key to victory, remembering Lore from the days when the world was young. They are bound not by hate, but by oath, he called above the clash of weapons. Speak to them in the old tongue. Remind them of what they once were. And so the ancient elf began to chant in Quenya, the high elven speech, words that had been old when the Silmarils first shone. He spoke of honor and duty, of the time before the shadow fell upon the world, and slowly the Guardians' movements became less certain. For a moment that seemed to last an age, the Crimson Guard stood motionless, their burning swords wavering in their grasp. Through the eye slits of their helms, a light that was not altogether evil began to shine, and when they spoke at last, their voices were like wind through autumn leaves. "Long have we stood watch," whispered the first Guardian. "Long have we served the darkness that we once fought against. The oath is broken," sighed the second. "The binding is severed. We are free." With those words, the Guardians lowered their swords and stepped aside. Their forms began to fade like mist before the morning sun, and in the moment before they vanished entirely, the company saw them as they had been in life. Noble warriors of Númenor, who had fallen in battle against the forces of the Spire in ages long past. The gate stood open before them, and beyond it rose a stair of red stone that spiraled up into the darkness of the tower. Each step was carved with runes of power and malice, and the very air above them pulsed with crimson light, like the beating of some vast and terrible heart. "Now comes the true test," said Gandalf, his staff blazing with white fire. "Within the spire lies the source of all this evil, a power that has slept for ages, but now stirs to wakefulness. We must climb to the very top and face whatever dwells there, though it may mean our doom." The stair that wound up through the interior of the spire was a marvel of dark architecture. The walls were smooth as glass and red as blood, carved with scenes that depicted the fall of kingdoms and the triumph of shadow. Each landing showed a different age of Middle-earth's torment: the destruction of the two trees, the fall of Gondolin, the sinking of Númenor, and other disasters both real and imagined. As they climbed, the air grew thick with whispers and half-seen shapes that flickered at the edge of vision. The spire was inhabited not by the living, but by the echoes of ancient malice, the recorded hatred and despair of all who had fallen under its influence across the long years. Gimli, stout-hearted though he was, began to stumble and gasp. "The very air seeks to choke us," he wheezed. "How much higher must we climb?" But Legolas, whose keen eyes could pierce the gloom, pointed upward to where a crimson glow pulsed in the darkness. "There," he said. "The heart of the spire beats like a living thing. The source of its power lies not at the top, but at its very center." They came at last to a great chamber that occupied the entire heart of the tower. Here the walls curved away into shadows, and in the center of the space hung a globe of red crystal large as a house. Within the crystal, shapes moved, figures of men and elves and other folk, all trapped in eternal torment. Their faces were twisted with anguish, their mouths open in silent screams, and their hands pressed against the crystal walls of their prison. "The Palantir of Sauron," breathed Gandalf, his face pale with horror. "But changed, corrupted beyond all recognition. These are not visions it shows, but soul, the spirits of all who have fallen under the spire's dominion across the ages." Around the crystal moved a figure that had once been a man, but was now something far more terrible. Tall he was, and proud, clad in robes of crimson silk that seemed to be woven from congealed blood. His face was fair but cold as winter stars, and his eyes held depths of malice that made the darkness of Mordor seem but a child's shadow play. "Welcome," said the figure, his voice like silk drawn across a blade. "I am he who was called Herumor in life, but am now the Crimson Lord, master of this spire and keeper of the souls within. You have climbed far and fought well to reach this place, but your journey ends here, in service to the darkness eternal." Herumor, for that had indeed been his name in life, began to speak, and his words carried the weight of ages. He told of how he had been a lord of Numenor in the days of its glory, but had been seduced by the lies of Sauron, and had fled east when Ar-Pharazôn sailed to make war upon the Valar. "I built this tower as a refuge," he said, his voice filled with bitter pride, "a place where the faithful of the shadow might gather and wait for the darkness to reclaim the world. But the Valar's wrath found even here, and my tower fell beneath the waves when Numenor was destroyed." Yet death had not been the end for Herumor. The dark arts he had learned from Sauron's servant had bound his soul to the Spire, and over the long years his spirit had grown in power and malice. When the tower rose again from the desert sands, called forth by the growing darkness in the world, Herumor had awakened with it. "Now I gather souls as a miser gathers gold," he continued, gesturing to the trapped spirits in the crystal. "Each one strengthens my power and feeds the hunger of the Spire. And you, noble fools, shall be the crown jewels of my collection. Elves and dwarves, men and wizards, all bound to serve my will for eternity." But even as he spoke, Círdan stepped forward, his ancient face filled with recognition and sorrow. "Herumor," he said softly, "I knew you once, in the days when Numenor was young and fair. You were my friend then, before the shadow took you. Do you not remember the gardens of Armenelos, where we walked in the starlight and spoke of hope and beauty?" For a moment, something flickered in the Crimson Lord's eyes, a shadow of the man he had once been. But then his face hardened once more. "That man is dead," he snarled, consumed by the glory of eternal darkness. "There is no hope here, Elf Lord, only power and the sweet taste of despair." With those words, he raised his hands, and the chamber filled with crimson light. The crystal began to pulse more rapidly, and from its depths came the screams of the imprisoned souls, their anguish made manifest as waves of terror and despair that crashed over the company like a tide. The battle that erupted in the heart of the Spire was unlike any that had been fought in Middle-earth. This was not a clash of sword and shield, but a war of wills and souls, where the weapons were hope and despair, love and hatred, light and shadow. Herumor struck first, calling upon the power of the crystal to assail his enemies with visions of their darkest fears. Gimli saw again the fall of Khazad-dûm and felt the weight of his people's exile. Legolas beheld the fading of the elves and the coming of the dominion of men. Each of the rangers faced his own moment of greatest failure, reliving his shame and regret. But Gandalf stood firm, his staff blazing with white fire that drove back the shadow. "These are but phantoms," he cried, "echoes of the past given power by your fear. Remember who you are. Remember why you came." The wizard's words kindled hope in their hearts, and one by one the company began to fight back. Elrond spoke words of power in the Grey Tongue, weaving spells of protection about his companions. Éomer raised his sword and sang the war songs of Rohan, his voice ringing clear and strong in the crimson gloom. But it was Círdan who struck the telling blow. Drawing upon his vast age and wisdom, the ancient elf began to speak not to Herumor, but to the souls trapped within the crystal. He told them of their lives before the darkness, of the joy and love they had known, of the choices that had defined them as people rather than prisoners. "You are not his property," Círdan called to the imprisoned spirits. "You are the children of Ilúvatar, and your souls are your own. Remember your name, remember your loves, remember your freedom." One by one, the souls within the crystal began to stir. They pressed their hands against the crystal walls, not in anguish now, but in defiance, and cracks began to appear in their prison. Light seeped through the fissure, not the corrupt crimson glow of the spire, but the pure silver radiance of hope itself. Heramore's form began to waver as his power was challenged. "No!" he screamed. "They are mine! I have fed upon their despair for ages. They cannot escape!" But even as he spoke, the crystal shattered with a sound like 1,000 silver bells. The imprisoned souls poured forth in streams of silver light, and as they passed through the chamber, each one paused to touch the foreheads of the company, a blessing from the grateful dead. With the destruction of the soul crystal, the crimson spire began to shake and tremble. The walls cracked, and dust and debris rained down from above. The tower that had stood for ages was dying, its power source destroyed, its foundations crumbling. Heramore, his form now translucent and flickering like a candle in the wind, made one last desperate attack. Drawing upon the last reserves of his strength, he sought to drag the company down with him into the darkness of death. His hands reached out like claws, and his face was terrible to behold in its fury and despair. But as he lunged forward, one of the freed souls interposed itself between the Crimson Lord and his intended victims. The spirit was that of a woman fair and noble, with stars in her hair and wisdom in her eyes. She spoke a single word in the Quenya tongue, a word of unbinding and release, and Heramore's form dissolved like mist before the dawn. "Peace, old friend," whispered the spirit, and for a moment her face was visible to all. Tarmiriel, the rightful queen of Numenor, who had been lost when the island sank beneath the wave. "Your long torment is ended. Come, let us go together into the light." The company fled down the crumbling stair as the spire collapsed around them. Behind them, the tower folded in upon itself like a dying flower, its crimson light fading to darkness. They reached the desert floor just as the last stones fell, and where the mighty spire had stood, there was now only a crater filled with silver sand. In the days that followed, as they made their way back to the coast and thence to Gondor, they found that the desert itself was changing. Green things began to grow where only wasteland had been, and the bitter waters became sweet. The curse that had lain upon the southern lands was lifted, and hope returned to places that had known only despair. But the greatest change was in themselves. Each member of the company bore within their heart the blessing of the freed souls, a reminder that even in the darkest hour, love and hope could triumph over hatred and despair. They had faced the ultimate test of their courage and had not been found wanting. And in the years that followed, when bards sang of their deeds, they called it the last battle of the Third Age, the final victory of light over shadow, hope over despair, love over hatred. The ghosts no longer guarded the Crimson Spire, for both the ghosts and the spire had found their peace at last. Thus ends the tale of the Crimson Spire, as recorded in the Red Book of Westmarch, and as told by those who witnessed these events in the days when the world was still young and magic walked openly upon the earth. Epilogue: The Silver Dawn, the healing of the South. In the years that followed the fall of the Crimson Spire, the transformation of the southern lands became the stuff of legend. Where once the desert had stretched in endless, lifeless dunes, now rivers began to flow again, following ancient courses that had been dry since the elder days. The sand itself changed color, from the ominous red that had marked the spire's dominion to a warm golden hue that caught the sunlight like scattered coins. Merchants from Harad brought word to the courts of Gondor of miraculous springs that bubbled up from the earth, their waters sweet and clear as mountain stream. Palm groves appeared seemingly overnight, their fronds rustling with a music that spoke of hope renewed. The nomadic tribes of the deep desert, who had fled their ancestral lands generations before, when the spire's malice began to spread, returned with songs of thanksgiving on their lips. King Elisar dispatched royal surveyors to map these transformed regions, and what they found exceeded all expectation. Not only had the corruption been cleansed, but the land had become more fertile than it had been even in the days before the shadow fell. Cities that had crumbled to dust were rebuilt, their white walls gleaming in the desert sun. and trade routes that had been abandoned for centuries were reopened, bringing prosperity to regions that had known only desolation. The change was not merely physical, but spiritual. The very air of the South, which had once carried whispers of despair and ancient malice, now sang with the voices of the freed soul. Travelers reported hearing music on the wind, not the haunting melodies that had once lured men to their doom, but songs of joy and liberation that lifted the heart and quickened the step. The company dispersed. When the heroes returned to Minas Tirith, they were greeted with such celebration as had not been seen since the coronation of the king. The white banners of Gondor flew from every tower, and the streets were filled with people singing songs of victory. Yet for all the joy of their homecoming, each member of the company carried within their heart a profound change wrought by their experiences in the Spire. Círdan the shipwright, ancient beyond measure, found that his sacrifice in the heart of the tower had cost him more than he had expected. His hair, which had been silver white, was now like starlight itself, and his eyes held depths that spoke of secrets learned in the realm between life and death. He lingered in Gondor only long enough to see the company safely home before returning to the Grey Havens, where he spent his remaining years in Middle-earth, preparing for his final voyage into the West. "I have seen the very face of redemption," he told Elrond before their parting. "Even the most fallen can find their way back to the light, given time and the love of those who remember what they once were. This knowledge is both a burden and a blessing, and I must carry it with me across the sea." Legolas found that his communion with the freed souls had awakened in him a deeper understanding of the song that runs through all living things. His archery, already legendary, became something approaching the miraculous. It was said that he could loose an arrow and have it find not just its target, but the exact point where it could do the most good, healing the wounded, protecting the innocent, or turning aside the weapons of the wicked. More importantly, the Prince of the Woodland Realm became a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the departed. Those who had lost loved ones sought him out, for he could sometimes hear the voices of the dead upon the wind and bring comfort to the grieving with messages from beyond the circles of the world. Gimli the dwarf returned to the glittering cave with a new understanding of the beauty that could be wrought from the marriage of craft and compassion. The weapons and armor he forged in the years that followed were not merely tools of war, but works of art that seemed to carry within their steel the very essence of hope. Warriors who bore Gimli's weapons found that their hearts remained light, even in the darkest battle, and their courage never failed them when the need was greatest. He established a school for young smiths, teaching them not only the techniques of metalworking, but the philosophy behind the craft. Every hammer blow, he would tell his students, should be struck with love for the one who will wield what you create. For in the end, we do not forge metal, we forge hope itself. The Rangers' Vigil. The three Rangers of the North, who had joined the company, found their calling transformed by their experience. Where once they had been solitary guardians of empty lands, they now became teachers and guides, passing on to a new generation the wisdom they had gained in the heart of the Spire. Haleth, the eldest of the three, established a school near Fornost where young men and women could learn not only the arts of woodcraft and war, but the deeper mysteries of protecting the innocent from the shadows that still lingered in dark corners of the world. His students were taught to recognize the signs of spiritual corruption, to cleanse places where evil had taken root, and most importantly, to offer redemption, even to those who seemed beyond all hope. "We learned in the Spire," Haleth would say, "that no soul is irredeemably lost, while love and memory endure. Our duty is not merely to fight the darkness, but to kindle the light in others, that they might fight it for themselves." His companion rangers, Beregond and Aldor, took different paths. Beregond traveled south to establish outposts along the borders of the transformed desert, watching for any sign that the ancient evil might stir again. But his vigil was different from the grim watch that rangers had kept in ages past. He and his men became friends and protectors of the returning desert tribes, helping them to reclaim their ancestral ways while remaining watchful for the subtle corruption that could turn hope into despair. Aldor chose perhaps the most difficult path of all. He went among the kingdoms of men, seeking out those places where old evils had left their mark. Haunted battlefields, cursed ruins, sites of ancient atrocity. With patience and compassion, he worked to cleanse these places, not through violence, but through acts of remembrance and reconciliation. He became known as the Healer of Shadows, and it was said that where he passed, old wounds were bound up and ancient hatreds laid to rest. The wizard's last teaching, Gandalf the White, remained in Middle-earth longer than any had expected, drawn by a sense that his work was not yet complete. The fall of the Crimson Spire had taught him much about the nature of corruption and redemption, and he felt called to share this wisdom with those who would carry on the fight against darkness in ages to come. He established no school, founded no order, but became a wanderer once more, appearing wherever he was most needed. To kings and commoners alike, he taught the same fundamental lesson, that the greatest victory over evil was not its destruction, but its transformation. Not the silencing of dark voices, but their conversion into songs of light. In the halls of Minas Tirith, he spoke to the young knights of Gondor about the nature of true courage. "You have been taught," he said, "to face your enemies with sword and shield, and this is good and necessary. But the greatest battles are fought not on fields of war, but in the chambers of the heart. Learn to fight with love as your weapon and forgiveness as your shield, and you will win victory that no sword could ever achieve." To the scholars of Gondor, he revealed secrets of the ancient days that had been hidden for centuries. He spoke of the music of creation and how the discord introduced by Melkor could be woven back into harmony through acts of conscious choice. He taught them to read the signs written in stone and star, wind and water, that spoke of the ongoing struggle between light and shadow in every corner of creation. But perhaps his most important teaching came to the children. In every city and village he visited, Gandalf would gather the youngest citizens and tell them stories, not merely tales of adventure and heroism, but stories that revealed the power each person possessed to make their corner of the world brighter. He taught them that magic was not the province of wizards alone, but lived in every act of kindness, every word of encouragement, every choice to hope rather than despair. The king's new realm. King Elisar found that the victory over the Crimson Spire had transformed not only the southern lands, but the very nature of his kingship. The ancient fears that had long divided the peoples of Middle-earth began to fade as word spread of how elf and dwarf, man and wizard, had stood together against the ultimate darkness and emerged victorious. Ambassadors came to Minas Tirith from kingdoms that had not sent envoys to Gondor in centuries. The Easterlings, long counted among the enemies of the West, sought alliance and friendship. The Southrons of Harad, their lands now blessed with unprecedented fertility, offered tribute not from fear but from gratitude. Even the wild men of Dunland and the distant lands beyond the Sea of Rhûn sent representatives to learn of the healing that had been wrought. Aragorn received them all with the same grace and wisdom, for he had learned in the heart of the Spire that every person, no matter how fallen, carried within themselves the spark of redemption. He established a new code of laws for his expanded realm, one based not on the harsh justice of earlier ages, but on the principle of restoration and renewal. A king's true strength, he proclaimed in the great council that established these new laws, lies not in his power to punish the wicked, but in his ability to help them become good. We shall build a realm where mistakes can be corrected, where failures can become foundations for future success, and where no one need despair of finding their way back to the light. Under this new philosophy, Gondor became a beacon of hope for all the troubled regions of Middle-earth. Cities were rebuilt, not merely to be strong against attack, but to be beautiful and welcoming. Trade flourished not just in goods, but in ideas, as scholars and artists from every corner of the known world came to contribute to the growing library of human knowledge and achievement. The Song of the Freed, Of all the wonders that followed the fall of the Spire, perhaps the most remarkable was the phenomenon known as the Song of the Freed. At certain times, usually at dawn or dusk, when the light was soft and the world seemed balanced between day and night, sensitive listeners could hear music drifting on the wind. It was not a sad song, as one might expect from the voices of the dead, but a melody of indescribable joy and triumph. Those who heard it described feeling as if a great weight had been lifted from their shoulders, as if some burden they had carried so long they had forgotten there had suddenly been taken away. Bards and musicians throughout Middle-earth attempted to capture this ethereal melody in their compositions, but none could fully reproduce its effect. The closest they came was in the great symphony composed by the master musicians of Dale and Laketown, working in collaboration with the elf harpers of Rivendell. Their Cantata of Liberation became one of the most beloved pieces of music ever created, and it was said that even the Ents of Fangorn would grow still to listen when it was performed in the nearby land. But the true power of the Song of the Freed lay not in its beauty, but in its message. For those who listened carefully, it spoke of a truth that transformed their understanding of life and death, joy and sorrow, victory and defeat. It sang of the great tapestry of existence, where every thread, no matter how dark or seemingly out of place, contributed to a pattern of overwhelming beauty and meaning. Children born after the fall of the Spire seemed to hear the song more clearly than their elders. They grew up with a natural understanding that death was not an ending, but a transformation, that sorrow was not meaningless, but the price and proof of love, and that even in the darkest hour, hope remained, if one knew how to listen for it. The final voyage. As the years passed and the Fourth Age deepened into its full glory, the time came for the last of the Great Ones to take their leave of Middle-earth. Elrond, having seen his realm restored to peace and his people safe for generations to come, felt the call of the straight road growing strong within him. Gandalf, his work at last complete, began to speak of the far shore and the light that waited there. The leave-taking was held at the Grey Havens, as had been the custom since the elder days, but this farewell was different from those that had gone before. Where once the partings had been tinged with sadness and loss, now there was a sense of completion, of a great work finished and handed on to worthy successor. King Elisar came to bid farewell to his friends and counselors, bringing with him Queen Arwen and their children. The new generation of Gondor's nobility gathered to pay their respects to those who had shaped their world. From every corner of Middle-earth came representatives of the peoples who had been touched by the victory over the Crimson Spire. But perhaps the most moving moment came when the transformed peoples of the South arrived to offer their own farewell gift. The desert tribes brought precious stones that had formed in the heart of their newly sweet oasis. The merchants of the reformed cities offered silks and spices of incomparable quality. Most precious of all, the children of these lands sang songs in the ancient tongue, songs they claimed to have learned in dreams from the freed themselves. As the white ship prepared to depart, carrying its cargo of immortal passengers toward the unknown west, a great silence fell over the assembled crowds. Then, as if summoned by the solemnity of the moment, the song of the freed rose on the evening air, clearer and more beautiful than ever before. This time, everyone could hear it, not just the sensitive few who had been blessed with the gift in earlier years. The melody soared over the harbor like a benediction, and for a moment that seemed to last forever, every person present understood their place in the great music of existence. They saw how their individual lives, with all their struggles and triumphs, contributed to a vast symphony of meaning that would play on long after they had passed from the circles of the world. When the song faded and the ship disappeared into the golden light of the setting sun, those who remained on the shore did not weep. Instead, they looked at one another with eyes full of purpose and hope, knowing that they carried within themselves the legacy of the great ones who had gone before. They had work to do, lives to build, love to share, and hope to kindle in dark places. The eternal light in the years that followed, years that stretched into decades, and then centuries. The victory over the Crimson Spire became more than history. It became a living truth that shaped the character of all who heard the tale. The story spread beyond Middle-earth, carried by traders and travelers to lands whose names were not recorded in any map or chronicle. Each telling of the tale changed slightly, adapted to the culture and understanding of those who heard it. But the central truth remained constant, that no darkness, however deep or ancient, could stand against the combined power of love, hope, and the willingness to believe in redemption, even for the most fallen. The Crimson Spire itself became a place of pilgrimage. Where the tower had once stood, a garden grew, the Garden of Second Chances, as it came to be known. Here, people from every walk of life came to meditate on the possibility of transformation, to seek forgiveness for their own failure, or simply to stand in a place where the impossible had been made real. At the center of the garden stood a fountain, whose waters were said to carry the voices of the freed. Those who drank from it did not hear specific words or messages, but felt instead a deep peace settle over their souls. The peace that comes from understanding that every ending is also a beginning, every defeat the seed of a future victory, and every act of love a light that can never be extinguished. The fountain was tended by an order of guardians drawn from every race and nation of Middle-earth and beyond. They took no vows of celibacy or poverty, owned no weapons save their compassion, and asked nothing of visitors save that they leave the garden a little more beautiful than they had found it. Many of these guardians were descendants of those who had witnessed the fall of the Spire, carrying in their veins the blessing of the freed, and in their hearts the memory of that great victory. And so the Fourth Age unfolded, not as a time of declining magic and fading wonder, but as an era of ever-expanding hope. The children of men grew in wisdom and compassion, learning to build cities that sang with harmony and to cultivate lands that bloomed with unprecedented beauty. The old divisions between the races slowly dissolved as the lesson of the Spire spread, that unity in diversity was not merely possible, but was the very foundation of true strength. Wars did not end entirely, for the freedom to choose meant the freedom to choose poorly as well. But even conflicts took on a different character. Armies marched not to destroy their enemies, but to convince them, and victory was measured not in lives taken, but in hearts changed. The arts of healing and building flourished as much as the arts of war had in earlier ages. The stars themselves seemed to shine more brightly in those years, and astronomers reported that the music of the spheres, long silent since the discord of the elder days, had begun to play once more. Poets and philosophers speculated that the harmony restored to one small corner of creation had begun to ripple outward, like circles on a pond, healing wounds that had festered since the very dawn of time. Thus does the tale of the Crimson Spire find its true ending, not in the destruction of evil, but in its transformation into good, not in the silencing of sorrow, but in its weaving into a song of joy, not in the victory of light over darkness, but in the revelation that light and darkness are but different notes in a vast symphony whose beauty grows with each passing age. The ghosts guard the Crimson Spire no more, for both the ghosts and the spire have found their rest. But the light they kindled burns on, passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, generation to generation. A flame that grows brighter with each sharing, a song that grows sweeter with each voice that joins the chorus, a hope that grows stronger with each choice to believe in the possibility of redemption. And in the end, perhaps that is the greatest magic of all. Not the power to change the world through force, but the wisdom to change it through love, one heart at a time, until the whole of creation rings with the music of second chances and new beginnings.